James Carter, a highly respected African-American FBI director, was known for his calm demeanor and dedication to justice. Despite his high rank, James often preferred to handle sensitive cases personally. One afternoon, he drove alone into a small, quiet town in the southern part of the country. His goal was to meet a confidential informant who had information about a dangerous case involving corruption. James decided to dress casually and use his personal car to avoid drawing attention to himself. The town was small and had a reputation for being unwelcoming to outsiders, especially people of color. Still, James believed in treating every situation with professionalism and respect. As he parked in the lot of a local diner, he couldn't help but notice a pair of officers in a patrol car nearby. They seemed to be watching him closely. James brushed it off at first, thinking they were simply doing their job. After all, his presence might have seemed unusual in a town where everyone knew each other. Stepping out of his car, James glanced at his watch, noting that he was a few minutes early for his meeting. He planned to sit inside the diner and keep an eye on the entrance. But as he turned to head toward the door, the patrol car slowly rolled closer. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out, stepping out of the car. His tone wasn't friendly. James turned and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, officers. How can I help you?" "What are you doing here?" the second officer asked sharply, eyeing James up and down. James calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his federal badge. "I'm FBI Director James Carter. I'm here on official business." Instead of easing the tension, the officers exchanged skeptical glances. One of them chuckled lightly, as if James's words were some sort of joke. "That's a nice story," the first officer said, folding his arms. "But why don't you tell us the real reason you're here?" James kept his composure, sensing the situation might escalate. "Gentlemen, I assure you, this is no story. I'm here for work. If you have any doubts, you're welcome to contact my office." The officers didn't seem interested in checking his credentials. Instead, their questions became more pointed, their tone more confrontational. As James stood there, he noticed another patrol car pull into the lot. He realized the situation was becoming more serious. His instincts told him it was time to act carefully. "I'd be happy to cooperate in any way," James said, maintaining his calm demeanor. But inside, his mind raced as he considered his next move. The officers didn't reply. Instead, they continued watching him like hawks, as if waiting for a reason to act. James subtly reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over a message he had pre-typed. "Send help. Urgent." The tension in the air grew thicker, and James knew that this was only the beginning of a much bigger challenge. James Carter remained calm as the officers continued to question him. He had encountered tense situations before, but something about this one felt different. The officers weren't interested in hearing the truth or verifying his identity. Their stares carried an air of mistrust, and their sharp tones made it clear they had already judged him. "Why don't you step over here for a moment?" one of the officers demanded, motioning for James to move away from his car. James hesitated for a brief moment. He understood the risks of complying, but also the dangers of refusing. With a calm nod, he took a step toward them, his badge still visible in his hand. "Officers, I assure you I mean no harm. I'm here on official business." "Sure you are," the second officer replied with a smirk. "But we'll need to see some ID. And don't make any sudden moves." James's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his driver's license. He handed it over, watching as the officer examined it. "This doesn't prove anything," the officer said dismissively. He held the license up to the light, as if searching for flaws. "Why would someone like you be driving around here?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm here to meet someone for an ongoing investigation. My presence is entirely professional. If you contact the FBI office, they can confirm everything." The officers didn't respond immediately. Instead, they exchanged glances, their skepticism growing. James could feel the tension in the air thickening. As they spoke quietly between themselves, James noticed a second patrol car pulling into the parking lot. Two more officers stepped out, their faces unreadable but their body language cautious. "What's going on here?" one of the new officers asked, walking up to the group. The first officer gestured toward James. "We've got a suspicious individual claiming to be FBI." The new officers looked James over, their eyes narrowing. James raised his hand slightly, a nonverbal sign of cooperation. "I have no intention of causing trouble," he said calmly. "I'm here for work. Please, check with my office." But the officers seemed uninterested in verifying his story. Instead, they surrounded him, their presence becoming more intimidating. "Step away from the vehicle," one of them ordered. James complied, though every instinct told him this wasn't about his credentials. It was about something deeper, something personal. As he stepped back, he discreetly sent the pre-typed message on his phone. "Send help. Urgent." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, hoping his team would arrive soon. The officers began searching his car without permission, their movements aggressive and determined. James clenched his jaw, but kept quiet, knowing that one wrong word could worsen the situation. Inside, he silently prayed for backup to arrive before things spiraled further out of control. Little did he know, the situation was about to escalate in ways he couldn't have imagined. The tension in the air was unbearable. James Carter stood still, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle the situation. The officers were now openly suspicious, even hostile. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as they continued to search his car, tearing through his belongings without explanation. "Where's your paperwork, huh? Why don't you show us everything?" one of the officers demanded. James remained calm, his voice steady. "I've already shown you my badge and identification. I'm telling you, I'm here on official FBI business." The officer scoffed, clearly not interested in his explanation. The more James spoke, the more the officers seemed determined to escalate things. He could feel the situation slipping out of his control. Just as James started to feel the panic creeping in, something in the officers' behavior changed. They began to move with purpose, like they had made up their minds. One of them suddenly pointed at James's car. "You're not going anywhere." "Not until we get to the bottom of this," the officer said. Before James could respond, the officer slammed the door of his car shut and turned to the others. "Let's go. We're taking him in for questioning." James's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. If they took him to the station, it would give them even more time to fabricate a story. If they really believed he was lying, this could get worse quickly. He needed to act fast. "I'm not going anywhere," James said, his voice firmer this time. "I'm a federal agent, and I'm asking for your cooperation. If you don't let me go, you're making a huge mistake." The officers exchanged a few quick glances, then suddenly, without warning, one of them stepped forward, hand on his gun. "Get back in your car. Now." James froze. He couldn't back down now. He had to be careful, but he also couldn't let them intimidate him. Taking a deep breath, he quickly scanned the parking lot for an escape route. He could see the alleyway behind the diner, a narrow, quiet path. It was a long shot, but it might give him a chance to slip away unnoticed. Without giving the officers time to react, James turned and bolted toward his car. The officers shouted after him, but he was already behind the wheel. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he started the engine. He slammed the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot, tires screeching. The officers quickly jumped into their vehicles and followed, their sirens blaring loudly in the distance. James's mind was focused on only one thing now: escaping the madness. The last thing he wanted was to make the situation worse, but he knew if he didn't get away, he might be trapped in a much more dangerous situation. As he took sharp turns down the back roads, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The police cars were still on his tail, and their pursuit was getting closer. James's breath quickened as the high-speed chase continued. Every second felt like an eternity. He had to find a way out of this, but the road ahead seemed to be getting narrower. The officers were relentless, and James could feel his chance of escape slipping away. James's heart raced as his car sped down the narrow alley. The sound of sirens grew louder behind him, and his rearview mirror showed the flashing red and blue lights drawing closer. He knew he had to think quickly, or he would be trapped. The road ahead was a dead end. He couldn't keep speeding forever. He scanned his surroundings, desperately searching for an escape. The alley was quiet, lined with old buildings, but there were no exits. He had no choice. James slammed the brakes, causing the car to jerk to a stop. The tires screeched in protest, and he quickly threw the car into reverse. But the officers were already closing in. Their cars roared down the alley, tires sliding on the slick road. James's eyes darted around. There was no time to think about what was happening. The officers would be on him in seconds. He had to hide. In a split second, James made a decision. He grabbed his phone, sending a quick message to his team. "Send help. Urgent." With one hand still on the wheel, he opened the door and jumped out of the car. The officers had already reached the alley, their cars screeching to a halt. James could hear them shouting commands, but he didn't stop to listen. He sprinted toward the first nearby object, a parked car. His heart pounded in his chest as he dove under the vehicle, hoping it would shield him from view. The world went quiet for a moment, and James tried to steady his breathing. His body pressed against the cold concrete, heart hammering. The alley was still, but he knew the officers were getting closer. His mind raced. He couldn't let them find him. From his hidden spot under the car, he could hear the officers' footsteps, their voices growing louder as they searched for him. Where did he go? One of them shouted. James held his breath, praying they wouldn't look under the car. He listened carefully, hoping the officers wouldn't spot him. He could hear them muttering to each other, frustration building in their voices. "He can't have gone far," another officer said. "Start looking around." James knew he had to stay hidden. The longer he stayed under the car, the higher the risk that the officers would find him. But if he made a sound or moved, he was as good as caught. He clutched the ground beneath him, his fingers digging into the dirt, trying to stay as still as possible. Minutes felt like hours as the officers combed the area. He could hear the rustling of their boots on the pavement, their voices growing more frustrated by the second. James couldn't afford to make a mistake. He glanced up slightly, peeking around the edge of the car, but there was no sign of the officers yet. They were still looking around, their attention divided, which gave him a chance to breathe. The tension in the air was thick. Every second that passed felt like it was drawing him closer to danger. He couldn't stay hidden forever. But right now, it was his only option. The officers were getting closer. James knew his window of opportunity was closing fast. As James lay motionless under the car, holding his breath, he felt the weight of the situation press on him. His mind raced, every thought focused on staying undetected. The officers were getting closer, but something unexpected happened, a small glimmer of hope in the midst of danger. Unbeknownst to James, someone was watching from a nearby apartment building. From a window high above, a teenager named Lisa was quietly observing everything. She had been in her room, studying for school, when she noticed the police cars and heard the commotion. Curiosity drew her to the window, and when she saw James being chased, her heart sank. She could tell something wasn't right. Lisa had grown up in a neighborhood where people of color often faced suspicion and unfair treatment. She had witnessed many of these tense situations from a distance, but she had never seen one so close. She could see the fear in James's eyes as he fled into the alley, his car getting trapped, and then his desperate attempt to hide. She quickly understood what was happening. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop or misunderstanding. James was being treated unfairly because of his race. Lisa knew she had to do something. Her first instinct was to run outside and help, but she knew she couldn't do that without making the situation worse. She needed to stay safe and out of sight. Instead, Lisa reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the camera app. Through the small lens, she began recording everything. She captured the officers' movements, the harsh way they searched James's car, and the moment he ran for cover under the vehicle. She made sure to keep her distance, positioning herself so the officers wouldn't see her. Her heart was pounding, but she focused on getting clear footage. As the minutes passed, Lisa's worry grew. The officers were becoming more aggressive in their search, shouting at James and threatening him with increasing force. Lisa watched in shock as they seemed to disregard his claims of being a federal agent. She could see the officers' frustration turning into something more dangerous. Lisa knew the recording could be crucial. If anyone could see how the situation was unfolding, it could help clear up the truth. As the officers continued to search the alley, she knew time was running out. She quickly sent the video to a trusted friend, urging them to contact the police and tell them what was happening. Lisa knew it wasn't enough just to have the footage. She needed help. She needed someone who could do something with the information. Despite the chaos unfolding right beneath her window, Lisa remained steady. She knew she had to stay quiet, remain hidden, and let the officers focus on their search. But in the back of her mind, she hoped the authorities would respond to her message in time. Back in the alley, James remained still, praying that the officers wouldn't find him. His breathing slowed as he listened to the footsteps drawing nearer. But unknown to him, the wheels of justice were slowly starting to turn. Back in the safety of the alley, James Carter's pulse continued to race as he lay hidden beneath the car. Every time he heard footsteps, his body tensed, praying that the officers would pass by without noticing him. His mind kept racing, calculating his next move. He had no idea how much longer he could stay hidden, or if help would arrive in time. Meanwhile, miles away, his team at the FBI office had already received the urgent message James had sent moments earlier. One of his colleagues, Agent Maria Hernandez, immediately recognized the severity of the situation. James wasn't just any agent. He was the director, a high-ranking official who had served for years. This wasn't just an ordinary case of harassment. Something much worse was happening, and the stakes were high. Maria's hands flew over the keyboard as she gathered the necessary resources. She quickly contacted the nearest federal authorities and alerted them about James's situation. Maria knew they had to act fast. There was no telling how long James could keep himself hidden from the officers, and the more time they wasted, the greater the risk. At the same time, Maria also reached out to Agent Derek Lee, a trusted field agent who worked with James on sensitive cases. Derek was known for his quick thinking and no-nonsense approach, and Maria knew he would be able to help. "Derek, it's an emergency," Maria said, her voice steady but urgent. "James is in trouble. He's in a small town, and the local police are targeting him. They don't believe he's with the FBI. We need to move now." Derek didn't hesitate. He had worked with James for years and knew how careful he was in difficult situations. If James had sent that message, it meant things had gone terribly wrong. "Got it. I'll gather the team and head over there immediately," Derek replied before hanging up. Back in the alley, James was still lying beneath the car, barely moving, as the search continued around him. The officers seemed to be growing more frustrated by the minute. They had already scoured the area, calling out to one another and trying to piece together what had happened. James knew his position was becoming increasingly dangerous. He couldn't stay under the car forever. His muscles were starting to ache, and every time a new officer arrived, the fear of being discovered grew. But then, just as James was about to move, he heard something that made him pause. The sound of a siren, faint at first, was growing louder. It was distant but unmistakable. Backup was on the way. James didn't know how much longer he could hold out, but the sound of the sirens brought a glimmer of hope. The cavalry had arrived, or at least he hoped they had. He dared not move from his position yet, not until he was certain the officers wouldn't find him first. The sirens drew closer, and James's heart began to race with renewed energy. Somewhere out there, Maria, Derek, and the rest of the FBI team were rushing to his side. They would bring the truth to light. But would they make it in time? James's heart pounded in his chest as he lay on the cold ground, hidden beneath the car. The sound of approaching sirens was the only thing keeping his hope alive. The backup was close, but would they arrive in time? His mind raced with thoughts of what could happen next. The officers around him were growing more agitated, their voices loud and sharp. "He's got to be around here somewhere," one of them shouted. James squeezed his eyes shut, praying they wouldn't find him. He had to stay still, to stay hidden. Every movement could be his last chance to avoid capture. As he lay there, he heard footsteps getting closer. The officers were moving in a circle, trying to figure out where he could have gone. They were nearly on top of him. "Check under the cars again," one of them barked. James's stomach dropped. His body tensed in fear, and he instinctively held his breath. The officers' voices grew louder, their shadows growing longer. He couldn't move, not even a twitch. He had to stay silent. Then the first officer knelt down beside the car, looking directly at the space where James was hidden. The officer's eyes scanned the ground, but they didn't stop at the spot where James lay. For a long moment, it felt like time had frozen. James's pulse raced, but he dared not breathe. The officer stood up again, moving away from the car. James couldn't believe his luck. He remained motionless, barely allowing himself to exhale. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they checked again. Just as he thought he might be in the clear, the sound of another vehicle's engine roared into the alley. This wasn't the sirens he had heard earlier. This was a new car, pulling up fast. The officers paused, confused. The car was unfamiliar, and it wasn't part of their plan. James could hear them whispering among themselves. "What's this?" "Back up," one officer asked. The door of the car slammed shut. James could hear heavy footsteps as someone approached, their voice low and menacing. "What's going on here?" the newcomer demanded. The officers immediately stood straighter, visibly nervous. The man who had arrived was a stranger, but his presence seemed to command attention. He was tall, his face partially obscured by a shadow. James knew this wasn't going to end well. Before he could process what was happening, the officer closest to the car spotted him. "There," he shouted, "under the car." Panic flooded James's body, and he moved instinctively, crawling out from his hiding spot. But the officer was already on him, grabbing him by the arm. James tried to break free, but the officer's grip was unrelenting. "No, stop," James shouted, but it was too late. Within seconds, the officers had pulled him up to his feet. He was outnumbered, and there was no way to escape. They didn't believe his claims of being an FBI agent. They didn't want to hear the truth. The officers began dragging him toward one of their patrol cars. James struggled, but he knew that resistance would make things worse. The newcomers seemed to watch, waiting to see what the officers would do next. Then, just as James thought the worst was over, he was thrown into the back of a patrol car. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had been caught in a lie he never told, trapped by the lies of others. James felt his vision blur as the car doors slammed shut. The worst was yet to come. Inside the back of the patrol car, James felt a heavy sense of dread wash over him. His body ached from being manhandled, and his mind struggled to comprehend the chaos unfolding around him. Despite his position as FBI director, he was now being treated like a common criminal, and the officers seemed to believe every false story they had made up about him. The car began to move, its engine humming as the officers drove down narrow streets. The world outside passed in a blur, but inside the vehicle, the silence was deafening. James couldn't help but wonder if this was how others had felt in similar situations, caught, helpless, and at the mercy of those who should have been protecting him. The officers in the front seat exchanged glances, but they didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. The weight of their actions was clear in the way they treated him. James's heart sank as he thought of the last message he had sent to his team. He had trusted them to come to his rescue. But now, trapped in the back of the car. He wasn't sure if they would make it in time. Back in the apartment building where Lisa had been watching, she anxiously checked her phone again. She hadn't received a response to her message yet, and her nerves were getting the better of her. She knew she couldn't stay quiet any longer. She needed to act. Her fingers flew over the screen, contacting her friend who had promised to make sure the authorities saw the video. "Please tell them to hurry. The FBI director's life could be in danger," she typed, sending the message with a sense of urgency. Lisa had no idea how much impact her actions would have, but she knew she had done what she could. The footage was now in the hands of those who could make a difference. Back in the patrol car, James's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ring of his phone. It was an unfamiliar number, but the ringtone gave him a surge of hope. This was his chance. James struggled to sit up, but the tight space and the constant pressure from the officers made it hard to move. He pressed the button to accept the call. "Hello, James, it's Maria from the FBI." The voice responded, clear and firm. "We're on our way. We know what's happening." Relief flooded James's chest, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he allowed himself to breathe. "Maria, I'm being taken in by the local police. They don't believe I'm with the FBI. They're making up lies." "We've got the video," Maria replied. "We've got your back. Don't worry. We'll handle this." James clung to her words, hoping they were enough to turn the tide. Within minutes, the backup James had been waiting for finally arrived. Federal agents pulled up beside the patrol car, their vehicles flashing with bright lights. The officers who had been driving James began to slow down as the agents approached, their eyes widening as they realized who had just arrived. James's team moved quickly, surrounding the car and calling for the officers to stop. The local police officers, still unaware of what was about to happen, hesitated for a moment before the reality of the situation set in. Maria and Derek, along with a team of FBI agents, spoke to the officers in charge, showing them the footage Lisa had recorded. The video made it clear what had happened. The police had wrongfully detained James, ignoring his authority and mistreating him based on his race. As the truth came to light, the local officers were swiftly arrested, and the charges were clear. The video provided undeniable proof of their misconduct. James could finally breathe a sigh of relief as the nightmare he had lived through was brought to a close. But as the dust began to settle, James knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice had only just started. The following days were a whirlwind for James Carter. After the agents had arrived and the local police officers were arrested, the news of the incident spread quickly. What had begun as a routine visit to a small town had turned into a nationwide story. People from all over the country were shocked by what had happened, and the video Lisa had taken became a symbol of injustice that could no longer be ignored. James was shaken, but also thankful that he had survived the ordeal. He had never imagined that something like this could happen to him, especially not in a place where he thought he was safe. But now, his story was being told in every news outlet, and his name had become part of a much larger conversation about systemic racism and police reform. Maria and Derek, along with the rest of the FBI team, had worked tirelessly to ensure that the truth was heard. The local police officers who had detained James were charged with misconduct, and an investigation was launched into the department's practices. The support from federal agents and the public was overwhelming, and the truth was clear for all to see. James was not only a victim of the officers' actions, but his position as FBI director gave him a platform to speak out about the need for change. As much as he wanted to move on from the ordeal, he realized that he could not ignore the bigger picture. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about the millions of people who faced similar treatment every day. James gave interviews with news outlets, sharing his experience and calling for accountability. His words resonated with many who had been affected by racism and unfair treatment. He spoke of his own experiences, of the fear and frustration he had felt during the encounter, and the importance of standing up for justice. The outrage from the public led to a series of protests across the country. People of all backgrounds came together, demanding that police departments be held accountable for their actions. The movement grew stronger every day, with many calling for better training, more oversight, and stronger laws to protect citizens from abuse of power. Through it all, James remained focused on the future. He knew that his role in this fight was far from over. He wanted to be part of the solution, not just a bystander. The incident had changed him in ways he hadn't expected, but it had also fueled his determination to make sure something like this never happened again. In the months that followed, James worked with lawmakers, activists, and fellow law enforcement officers to push for reform. He was part of discussions that led to new policies aimed at improving how police interacted with the public, especially marginalized communities. His leadership helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Looking back, James knew that his experience had not been in vain. The battle for justice had just begun, but it was a battle that had the power to change the future for the better. He was proud to be part of something bigger than himself, something that could leave a lasting legacy for generations to come. James Carter, the man who had been forced to hide under a car, became a symbol of strength and resilience in the fight for a more just and equal world.